When you think of the maddest lad of World War II, you often think of famous people like Mad Jack Churchill or George Patton. Maybe you think of people like Richard Best, Audie Murphy, John Basilone, maybe even Otto Skorzeny. I mean, the guy rescued Mussolini from a mountain castle. Like, that's stuff straight out of James Bond. But when you consider all of these, you're all wrong. Everyone on the internet is wrong. They aren't the maddest lads. Not at all. Hell, even in this particular field, Erich Hartmann of Jagerschwader 52, a fighter pilot in the Luftwaffe, ended World War II with 352 air-to-air kills, the most successful fighter pilot of all time. By all accounts, this man on paper was also a mad lad and the greatest fighter pilot ever. But he wasn't. He doesn't hold the title for either of those. The title of maddest lad and greatest ever fighter pilot is the man we are going to discuss today. A man who triumphed against childhood sickness, a charming and some say legendary womanizer, an eloquent socialite, an accomplished artist, a great sportsman, a classically trained pianist with a love of jazz, and the ultimate humanitarian, leading him to directly challenge the racist, dogmatic, evil regime which ruled his country on more than one occasion, even going so far as directly challenging that to its leader's face. In fact, he was so dedicated to his humanitarian ideals, he would go as far as to save the lives of the enemy where he could. But most of all, despite all of these character traits, most of all, by the forces of fate and nominated by his peers, he was one thing. He was the most talented fighter pilot to ever do battle in the skies. Killed in an accident far before his time. He was known as the Star of Africa, Hans Joachim Marseille, the maddest lad of World War II, and the greatest fighter pilot to ever live. On the 13th of December 1919, in the Berlin suburbs, the world met Hans Joachim Marseille, and it wasn't ready. Nobody was ready. Born to a middle-class household, his father was a retired army officer working for the Berlin police. His name was Siegfried Marseille. He would later become a general during World War II, when he was called back to duty. His mother, Charlotte, meanwhile, was a German officer's housewife with all that entailed, and her children were everything to her. She was a very doting mother. This was despite the strained relationship with her husband who was often to have extramarital affairs and heavy drinking. I'm sure this will not become a theme. While growing up, Joachim was known as a very boisterous, happy-go-lucky kid, but tragedy almost struck as he caught a deadly case of influenza. As we know, given recent events, this is exceptionally nasty for children, but by some miracle, most likely fate combined with his soon-to-be-seen obnoxious, stubborn willpower, he survived. But the long illness and subsequent recovery meant his growth was stunted, leading to a very skinny and somewhat frail build. However, this led to something quite predictable, given his personality. Rather than accept his weakness, he got a chip on the shoulder, and much like a certain 80s incestuous time-traveling rock star, nobody calls him chicken. He soon went to school, and as predicted, he became the absolute bane of his teacher's existence. Always the center of attention, always playing pranks. The thing was, though, he was doing all of this nonsense while maintaining some of the best grades in the class. His teachers saw potential, and so his school principal checked his vibe, and basically challenged him to do better, or basically, you'll be a failure. Do better or you'll do nothing with your life. You'll be good for nothing. You'll be a nobody. Marseille, being who he was, took this as a challenge to his ability and his very character, and as such busted his ass until eventually he graduated near the top of his grade. He had gone from the delinquent to the star pupil. But most noticeably of all, he had developed a very strong sense of honor and justice. In his high school diploma, the headmaster's note said, "A man with a strong sense of honor and shows great promise." When asked what he wanted to do with his life at his graduation ceremony, he answered firmly and proudly. There was only one thing this man wanted to do with his life. "I want to be a flying officer." But before he could do that, like all the young men in Nazi Germany, upon completing school, the now ostensibly adult Hans Joachim Marseille was drafted to do his mandatory year in the Reichslabor Service, or the Reichsarbeitsdienst. During this time, he did all the normal activities, clearing trails, digging roads for the Autobahn, helping drain bogs, and here too he was, well, Marseille. If there was a practical joke or an illicit activity involving alcohol or gambling, you can be damn sure he was one of the ringleaders. It got him into trouble more often than not, but at the same time, everyone liked him. He also ensured that just because of his father's status as a general or his weak condition, that he wasn't left out. In fact, on one assignment, they were going to be doing some seriously heavy work, and he was removed from the roster as a result of his frail build and his father's status, only for him to raise formal protest to be reinstated, upon which he got the highest performance evaluation from anyone in his group for that job. We're just going to casually gloss over the fact that he essentially achieved this by marching into the office of the man 3 ranks higher than his next superior and demanded, instead of requesting, reinstatement. Discipline was not really his forte. But with his glowing proficiency evaluations and his good grades, he went down to the recruiting office and sure enough was accepted as an officer cadet in the Luftwaffe, with priority for training on fighters. He breezed through basic training, giving his intelligence and already excellent fitness. He had worked really hard at improving that. And then he got to flight school. And Marseille took to flying like a fish to water. He was a natural. In fact, his level of proficiency, despite only being a beginner, was something his instructors were baffled by. Within several weeks, he was flying as well as they did. Maybe even better. The problem was, Marseille knew it too. While doing a training circuit under observation, he had a mock dogfight with an imaginary opponent, throwing his aircraft around the sky, doing incredible aerobatic feats. He's a newbie. He's not allowed to be doing this, but he just decided, hell, I'm just gonna dogfight the sky. Why not? I can do what I want. While this is impressive, this also posed a risk to the safety of himself, his fellow pilots nearby, and the aircraft. He was in serious shit. And then, naturally, he got into even more. Marseille had to do cross-country navigation training. All pilots have to learn how to navigate via landmarks and via instruments under requirements and certain conditions, right? He went on cross-country training. And after a while, people were kind of confused, because normally you're supposed to return after you complete your navigation assignment. It was getting really late. He was really late back. Where the hell is he? After several hours went by and they think, well, maybe he's got to be running out of fuel, a search party was organised, only for Marseille to come into landing. His aircraft was basically on fumes. Perfectly fine. He's fine, the aeroplane's fine, no problems. Turns out he'd been having such a lovely time as it was a good day, he completed the exercise within 10 minutes, and then decided to fly around and do some aerobatics, buzzing low over towns, launching mock strafing attacks on cars. He was doing barrel rolls and loops, he was just playing around. It was then he ran into a problem. A problem that all pilots run into eventually. He needed to go to the bathroom. But rather than return to base, because that would take too long, he needed to go right now, he decided to take a more pragmatic and direct approach. He landed on the Autobahn, one of the Führer's great new highways. He landed on it and went on one of the trees alongside the road. But it didn't stop there. After getting reprimanded for doing this, the next week, he did the same thing again, only this time he landed on the road near one of his girlfriend's places. One of his girlfriends. And he proceeded to put his gentleman's equipment to a very, different kind of use. But Despite these frankly outrageous disciplinary infractions, his aptitude reports for flying and gunnery were so good. He was so good in his evaluations, it would be a waste of a good pilot to court-martial him and kick him out. So they did the only thing they could do. They hoped that sending him to fighter pilot school would shape him up. So they sent him to Jagdflieger School 5, which is essentially fighter pilot college, the final point before given your full wings and deployed to a squadron. Again, here he got the highest scores, but seeing as he was now technically on operational training, he was no longer under the strict regiments and regimes that cadets are kept under. Meaning that he had liberty passes now. He was allowed to go out and do stuff when he wasn't training or flying. And thus his reputation for carousing was born in earnest. On multiple occasions, his roommate would find a note from Marseille on the door saying, "Hey, I've gone out, could you pull duty for me?" Which is a complete dick move. Being a nice, charming, and popular guy can only get you so far, and no one likes a blue falcon, and so his fellow pilots had started to develop a particularly dim view of him for his behavior. Especially the watch officer. The watch officer got so pissed off and sick of his shit, they actually posted him as a permanent on weekend shifts, just to make sure he stayed on base. You are not going out on weekends, we can't let you. But, yet again, when final exams came, he was the top student, with the highest flight exam scores any of the instructors had ever seen. No one had ever gotten a perfect score before, and yet this problem child, bohemian with anorexia and an attitude that was completely unacceptable, was somehow the best pilot cadet in the Luftwaffe's history, and he would keep that record for the entirety of the Second World War. He was the best student ever to pass through the Luftwaffe academies. Ever. And so, well, there's only one thing they can do with him. They post him to the most prestigious squadron, Lehrgeschwader 2, the demonstration wing, a mixed formation used to test out new tactics, new aircraft, and home to some of the finest pilots. That's right. He was made a combat test pilot. This is a serious role, a serious job. This is a big deal and a good posting for a new pilot to get. And its squadron leader was one of the most elite members of the Condor Legion, the men who fought in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. His name was Herbert Illefeld. It was hoped that being posted to such a prestigious unit, surrounded by men with experience and skill to match his own as well as facing real combat, it was hoped that this would give him the attitude adjustment and the perspective that he needed. But I'm sure that all of you are seeing a pattern here. On August 10th, Marseille reported to the LG2 base on the French coast facing the English Channel. The Battle of Britain was ramping up. A skinny young pilot with boyish looks, an ill-fitting unkempt uniform, with a haircut well out of regulations had arrived. Little did the men on the Channel front know, they were about to meet someone they would never forget. Upon reporting for duty, it was noted that he was late, something he would soon become notorious for. Good first impressions, therefore, were well out the window, but Illefeld knew that these hotshots had an air for the dramatic. Everyone thinks they're hot shit when they graduate flight school, they just need time to get an ego check. And having seen his report card and the letter from the schoolmaster, a man who all the experienced Luftwaffe men knew, he decided to see Marseille for himself. The aforementioned letter, by the way, warned all officers taking command of him that Marseille was a huge pain in the ass, but if utilised properly, he would be an incredibly effective pilot. Sure enough, over his 2-week familiarization period, where he learned the local landmarks in the squadron's operating area, Illefeld was confident that his new pilot was an ace in the making, and so he was put on the roster for flight operations on the 24th of August, 1940, for a mission over England. It was time for Marseille to see his first combat. Flying with Lehrgeschwader 2 on a fighter sweep over Kent, Marseille had his head on a swivel when he spotted a Hawker Hurricane slightly below the formation. In fact, it was rather freakish. His eyesight was so good, the rest of his unit hadn't seen this guy. But, a pattern would begin this day as well. Without orders or even direction, he called out the bandit and broke away, diving straight at the enemy. Unfortunately for Joachim, this just so happened to be a British flight leader, who, seeing him coming, broke into his attack and began the dogfight. What followed was a grueling 4-minute engagement with changing advantages. They were going back and forth, rolling, diving, climbing, turning. The enemy pilot was clearly more experienced than he was, but he was definitely the more talented pilot. And after skillful maneuvering, he got an opening and tore the Hurricane to pieces, sending it down in flames straight into the English Channel. Seeing this, he decided to check his tail, only to see that his squadron was now entangled with the rest of the Hurricanes. He had, by his exuberance, started a huge furball dogfight, but one of the flight had broken off, and now he had at least 4 RAF fighters tearing after him in search of vengeance. He had just shot down their flight lead, and the Brits were pissed. Marseille dove to the deck, making use of his 109's fuel-injected engine. Pulling up at about 10 feet of altitude, he ran back home and landed safely. Marseille had done what maybe only 100 fighter pilots in history have achieved. He had scored a kill on his very first combat flight. It definitely would be the first record of note he'd set. However, the jubilation this would normally inspire in a fighter pilot wasn't there. Joachim was exceedingly bothered by the fact that the pilot didn't bail out. He had just killed someone, and he wrote of the experience in his diary. "Today I shot down my first opponent. It does not sit well with me. I keep thinking how the mother of this young man must feel when she gets the news of her son's death, and I am to blame for this death. I am sad instead of being happy about this first victory." It was almost certainly this moment of realization that drove him throughout his career to target the enemy's engines above all else and avoid shooting the cockpit. This became so noticeable that later, Adolf Galland, Luftwaffe General of the fighters, asked him why he did this. Marseille responded that he didn't want to kill a man unless he absolutely had to. And, with his God-given ability to fly and shoot, Marseille was one of the few pilots who could actually put that policy into practice. However, this was in the future. Right now, he was still just learning how to fight and fly at the same time. He was still developing the craft and his skills. And so, he continued to fly and fight. Not satisfied with pulling off one insane feat, he shot down an enemy aircraft on his very next mission, and then got another one the week later, and another few the days after that. By September 18th, he was an ace with the Iron Cross First Class and a proven ability in the air. Surely, now, after all this time, after this combat experience, he's been tempered, he's been refined, and his superiors now appreciate him, even for all his rough edges, right? Nope. For you see, while all these achievements were impressive, they were matched by his, off-base evening activities. There was not a girl in Calais who hadn't seen Joachim's, mastery of the stick. And I'm pretty sure the champagne stocks in France, of all places, were taking a severe beating. But the bars and restaurants didn't mind so much. He tipped generously and was generous with his, Anyway. These bad habits also translated to his attitude in the air. As we saw in his first victory, he broke formation and charged after the enemy. This aggressiveness is excellent, and in fact it's required for a fighter pilot. You need to be aggressive in air combat. But it must be harnessed with calculated risk and smart prep work to achieve a superior tactical position before you make that attack. Diving headfirst into a squadron of enemy fighters is a quick way to get killed. It was only his skill as a pilot and the fact that he usually shot down some of his attackers that allowed him to survive. It's very similar to the style of Albert Ball, the British World War I ace, in fact. But it also meant that his aircraft was a write-off half the time, having taken so many rounds it probably only flew due to the force of Joachim's personality. He had to make 3 emergency landings and bailed out once, and that was another dramatic story. After fighting with the RAF to protect a squadron of HE-111s, he and his group were returning back to base when suddenly 257 Squadron RAF appeared in their Hurricanes to harass the bombers on their way back over the channel. Marseille, having incredible eyesight as we mentioned before, spotted them first and sounded the alarm. He turned into the attack and engaged the flight leader. And while I've kept harping on about how talented he is, as one thing you guys probably know, especially if you've watched a lot of action movies or sports shows or sports anime even, talent can only get you so far. When you meet other talented people, you realize that training and experience is vital to turning that talent into skill. And Marseille had just picked a fight with one of Britain's most famous fighter pilots, Robert Stanford Tuck, a multiple ace, who, after a brief and intense combat, sent young Joachim for a swim. He was picked up by Air Sea Rescue and visited the local doctor, who had by now begun sarcastically asking Marseille to phone ahead on his flying days, just so he could clear his schedule. Joachim had broken formation and attacked on his own, leaving his wing leader, all while low on fuel and ultimately getting himself shot down. He was on the commanding officer's shit list by now, and it wouldn't take much more to get him into real trouble. And of course, that real trouble came a week later. And of all the things to get a serious reprimand for, in a cruel irony, it was actually an act of heroism. Due to his previous shenanigans, it was made clear to Marseille that any more unauthorized breaks of formation would be met with proper punishment. Thus, he dutifully flew his wingman slot. He stayed in formation, checking around, looking for bandits, and following orders. LG-2 was on a patrol over Kent in the waning days of the Battle of Britain, when his flight of 18 Bf-109s ran across none other than the famous Duxford Wing. Douglas Bader and the Big Wings had started making their presence known, and sure enough, a flight of no less than 40 Spitfires and Hurricanes was making their way south in preparation for a suspected air raid on London. Seeing this horde coming, the commanding officer immediately ordered the group to withdraw. Marseille, in his natural temperament, wanted to turn and fight the entire formation, but such a course would have been stupid and most likely suicidal, and so he followed his wing leader, only to notice something odd. A flight of Hurricanes had dived low from their superior altitude and was now sneaking up on the formation below and behind. Marseille, without hesitating, broke off and engaged them, blasting the Hurricane lining up his flight lead into component parts. When they got back, he expected to be thanked or even commended. After all, everyone in the squadron just saw him shoot that guy down and save his flight lead. But no, he was grounded and confined to quarters. He had disobeyed direct orders to withdraw from combat. Not only that, he broke formation yet again, precisely when he was given a direct order not to. Marseille protested, but the commanding officer made his point very clear. The rear formation and the guys on the other side also saw the Hurricane, and as part of doctrine it was their responsibility to handle it. What Marseille should have done was contact the guys in the rear of the formation and say, hey, we have bandits approaching us 6 o'clock, could you guys get that? It was their job. Even though he may have gotten a victory and done the right thing by his wing leader, he put the rest of the unit at risk by breaking formation. The commanding officer was right. He was absolutely right. Marseille may be a hero, he may be the best, but he is part of a team, and teamwork requires trust in your squadron mates. Pulling shit like this undermines discipline and morale. One day he might do one of these crazy plays, and it will be a miscalculation, and then not only he, but his friends' lives would be at risk. Then came a chance to redeem himself. There was a general coming to inspect the squadron, and thus a flight demonstration was arranged. Ihlefeld, despite having no patience for his bullshit, also knew that in terms of aerobatic skill, Marseille was the best pilot in the squadron. In fact, he was probably the best pilot in the entire Luftwaffe, except for maybe Ernst Udet, but he was an older man mistakenly put in charge of research and development at this stage. So, Marseille was put on the flight roster again to fly the display with the following orders. Finally, you have permission to show us your stuff, Marseille. Take off and show a thing or two that'll blow the general's hat off. Marseille, having an ego approximately the size of the fictional state of Wyoming, readily accepted the job, as it meant he got to do what he loved. Show off. And this time, he would actually be praised and given credit for it. So, when the general arrived, Marseille climbed into his 109, ripped down the runway into the air, and then came back over the field. He performed stunts one after another, barrel rolls, slow rolls, wingovers, high-speed flypasts, loops, spins, and recovery, an outside loop. He even performed inverted maneuvers, as with the direct injection, the 109 could keep its engine running for a while flying upside down. The spectators were floored, and he had kept at it. He had kept at it for almost half an hour. He was doing things that aircraft really shouldn't be able to do. And had he kept doing that, had he simply kept to the normal aerobatics for a teen, there wouldn't have been any problems. But, say it with me, ladies and gentlemen, it's Marseille. As the last flypast happened at full speed over the airfield, he waggled his wings. This was the signal for one of the ground crew he knew to run out and place a meter-high pole near the airfield perimeter. Attached to this pole was a white handkerchief. To the disbelief of everyone present, including Illefeld, his commanding officer, Marseille brought the 109 down in on an approach, just above stalling speed, and brought the 109 down until he was wings level at less than a meter of altitude. His propeller was literally cutting the grass, and as he flew by the pole, he caught the handkerchief with his wingtip, pushed to full power, and climbed away into a roll, before gaining speed, pulling into a loop, dropping his flaps and his landing gear, and then landing at a precisely marked spot. Taxiing to a stop, it was the most impressive flying anyone had ever seen. And it was also the most dangerous flying anyone had ever seen, and the general said so. In doing this performance, he had violated no less than about 5 standing regulations. Several of them could have been waived as part of a handling display, but that last one could not. That was unacceptable risk of government property, unacceptable risk of the pilot's life, and posed a danger to the VIPs who were watching the display should the aircraft go out of control and crash. He was grounded and confined for 5 days. Now, a normal man, a wise man, would take this, wear it, learn from it, and develop as a person. But Joachim? No. What he did next is scarcely believable. He went to the officers' club, downed several shots of schnapps, walked back out, stole the commanding officer's motorcycle, and drove off at top speed. After hitting up a few bars, he got back on the bike, Joe rode around, and eventually decided to do some amateur landscaping, leaping from the vehicle as it ever so slightly slammed into a tree at 50 miles an hour, totaling it in the process. That was it. That was the last straw. He had wrecked 4 Bf 109s, and now the commanding officer's bike. Lehrgeschwader II designated him persona non grata, and as such he had to be transferred. But where the hell to? Where do you send this guy? They can't send him back to home defense. Despite all his faults, he's still useful. What they need is a man who can handle this kid. They need a unit full of madmen like him where he'll fit in. And he'll need enough oversight. Someone who's used to handling pieces of shit like this. There was only one place he could go. They sent him to Giga-Chad 52. The unit that would one day become the most successful fighter squadron in human history. And funnily enough, it's not thanks to him, mind you. That title would be due to Gerhard Bachhorn, Walter Krupinski, Gunther Roll, and Erich Hartmann, the first 3 of which Marseille was about to meet, along with their ever-suffering leader, Johannes Mackie Steinhoff. Steinhoff had received notice that he was getting a new pilot. Most of the units on the channel needed new guys, as the Battle of Britain had taken a chunk out of their numbers. He got Marseille's file as part of the transfer and had requested his service record from the Luftwaffe admin department. When he opened it, he saw good signs. Perfect scores from flight school, the Iron Cross First Class, 7 kills already, and a tour with the demonstration wing, which he himself had been a part of. Then he checked the dates of rank section, and something was weird. An ace with the Iron Cross and these evaluation scores? Why the hell was he still the lowest rank that's allowed to fly? Hell, he should be a flight leader right now. Why is he even being transferred to me if he's this good? It was then that his adjutant brought in Marseille's service record with a solid thunk. Steinhoff opened the page, and his heart sank. Written in front of what seemed like a 100-page document was the title page, Disciplinary Record. Oh my god. He had thought maybe they'd gotten an understated hero. Maybe he just didn't fit in with his old unit. But no. They had a delinquent. I will now continue in Steinhoff's own words. It was all there. He had everything. Confinement, disobeying orders, public drunkenness, disrespect, violation of flight regulations, low buzzing control towers and airfields, auto theft, being out of uniform, late for duty, drunk on duty, being out of uniform again, breaking formation without orders or authorization. I could go on. I then saw that he only needed to lose one more 109 to be considered an Allied ace. End quote. At that moment, he called Marseille into his office. He was waiting outside. And here he came. Hat at a Geordie angle, belt not fitted properly, tennis shoes on instead of boots, and he didn't even salute when reporting. He didn't even stand properly to attention. If you thought he'd had a bad first impression before, oh man. Oh boy. Steinhoff walked up to him in complete disbelief at the so-called officer he had standing in front of him. Again, in his own words, he looked 15. This child was standing in front of me. And so, brandishing the file in his hands, he stared Marseille down. What the hell is this? It's thick enough to be a goddamn telephone directory. As calmly as anything, Joachim replied, Sir, I've never wrecked an airplane. Steinhoff looked at him in complete disbelief. And it was then he asked the next important question. Be all that as it may, I have to ask you, after all of these infractions, what gives you the gall to report to duty a day late? Now, Steinhoff would say later that Marseille was many things. A drunkard, a playboy, a car thief, occasional idiot. But a liar or a cheat, Marseille definitely was not. He still had that strong sense of honour, even if he was a bit of a wild card. Joachim replied that he had been with a girl at a hotel and had lost track of time. Also that he had partaken quite heavily and as such was not in a fit state to report yesterday. In fact, Mackie had a sneaking suspicion he wasn't really in a fit state to report today either, given his condition. At that point, he called him to attention, and that moment did stick with him. All of the training and instinct that Marseille had built up kicked in at that point. Marseille was a rebel for sure, but with a general as a father and enough times in solitary as well as basically enough time in the military at this point, he knew the score. He snapped rigid, straight to attention. In fact, he snapped to attention so hard that his hat fell off while doing so. Steinhoff warned him that shenanigans would result in the whole of his Luftwaffe flying boot being wedged so far up his scrawny posterior he'll taste the boot polish, at a velocity exceeding his 109's top speed. And now, get the hell out of my office. Not wanting yet another Luftwaffe Article 15, Marseille saluted so hard, his hat fell off again, Yep, he picked it up when it fell off. He saluted so hard it fell off again. He did an about face, grabbed his hat off the floor, and then marched out. Mackie then got on the phone to Herbert Illefeld of LG2, a close personal friend, and yelled down the receiver at him, "Bert, what the hell have you done to me?" "Sorry, Mackie. I had to put him somewhere. I didn't have the machines for my pilots. That's because the guy you just sent me crashed them all." "Look, Mackie, I know my limitations. You are like a father figure to your men. I didn't mean to do this to you, but you're his best shot. The kid has potential. Good luck. You'll need it." Before Steinhoff could get another word, the line went dead. Well, he decided there's nothing else for it. I've got to straighten out this renegade. But despite being the man who would end up taming Germany's finest pilots, he was about to realize you can't win them all. Their first mission went, well as can be expected. On mission, they crossed the channel, eyes out for the RAF, and sure enough, the British were more than happy to oblige them. A Hurricane squadron made their appearance, and the two sides geared up for a fight. The flights separated. Steinhoff checked his wing, and sure enough, Marseille was nowhere to be seen. As soon as he checked his wing, he heard a voice come over the radio. "Got him!" Snapping around, he saw a Hurricane smoking, diving for the deck, quickly followed by another sentence, as a 109 frantically started evading. "Oh shit, they got me!" Marseille had just learned another lesson. If it looks like an easy kill, it's a trap. The rest of the Hurricanes were waiting above that lone Hurricane and had pounced. It was only the fact that Joachim was a god-tier aerobatic pilot and had a dose of 24-karat luck that he got away with it. Until he ran out of fuel and then had to land on the beach. And that was a mercy compared to what Steinhoff was going to do to him. Without even thinking, the moment Marseille returned, he was grounded, sentenced to helping the mechanics and pulling sentry duty. But Steinhoff had made one fatal mistake. He hadn't confined him to base. He didn't think it was necessary. He's an officer and a gentleman. So, that evening, Marseille, once he clocked off duty, went into the town, vanishing into the night. The next morning, there was a squadron briefing. All officers were required to attend. Even if he wasn't flying, he had to be kept up to date and learn the basics of how Jagerschwader 52 runs. The meeting started, and one officer was missing. 3 guesses which officer that was. And so, Steinhoff started the briefing, and kept the briefing running, awaiting his arrival. He waited, and waited, until the meeting was nearly over, when a car pulled up, driven by an absolute drop-dead gorgeous beauty, like one of the hottest women you'd ever seen. Out of the back seat emerged yet another stunning young woman. She was also gorgeous, and seemed a bit skimpily dressed. She quickly moved over into the front passenger seat. She was straightening her dress as she did so. And out of the other door hopped Marseille, minus his jacket, hat, and tie, which he retrieved from the back seat. He then moved over to the driver's side window, passionately kissed the driver, and then steadily began assembling his uniform as he walked across the airfield and approached the door of the squadron office. Upon entering, Steinhoff eyed him coldly. Late for the briefing, he asked him what his game was. Marseille said, without hesitation, and I quote, "Sorry, sir. The girls kept me busy and I was exhausted. By the time I'd woken up, I realized that I'd be late for the briefing and decided to have breakfast. I won't let it happen again." Absolute Chad. Mackie quite rightly confined him to base for the foreseeable future. Clear distinction, though. He'd confined him to base, not to barracks. He wasn't being guarded. Later that week, they held a parade for a visiting general. In fact, it was the same general that had visited the other base at LG2. Luftwaffe General Hans Joachim. The squadron stood in formation and the inspection took place. The newer pilot seemed a bit nervous, although one of them, Walter Krupinski, had fit in rather well. As the general went down the line inspecting the pilots, he stopped when he came to Marseille, hair still too long, with a stoic expression on his face. Yeshenek was actually confused. This guy was posted to LG2. This is Ihlefeld's guy. He's the guy who did all the aerobatics. Why the hell are you down here? Joachim replied, I heard the hunting was better down here, sir. That may be so, Marseille, but the girls down here have their honour and are off limits to the likes of you. The squadron erupted in laughter, as did Marseille, knowing he was well and truly deserving of it. The general clapped him lightly over the head, knocking his hat off, still laughing, and continued the inspection. If only this good-humoured jab would knock some sense into him. In fact, Marseille had a really bad habit of discipline, actually. Not just all of this. When visiting generals and officers like 5 to 6 ranks senior than him came round to the base, and it was an officer that Marseille knew because of his dad, he would address him like a friend and forget to salute. Like, seriously, this man just doesn't give a shit. But even after all this nonsense, Marseille did eventually get back on flying operations and continued flying with the squadron, and he scored several victories. However, none of them were actually confirmed because, yet again, despite the warnings of his boss, he kept breaking formation and chasing after the entire RAF by himself. In Mackey's own words, his excesses aside, it was this that put him on my shit list. After finally getting back on operations after all his shenanigans, he was once again sentenced to life as ground crew. This time, though, he was confined to base, right? Well, as the sun set and the evening twilight graced the airfield in its beauty, the sound of a car starting could be heard, shattering the calm. Though no one paid any attention to it, because the only person on the base with a car was the commanding officer. He was probably going out. But the light was on in his office. So who's driving the commander's car? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. The next morning, Mackey awaited his return. And so he did. Late, once again. But it was worse. He wasn't driving. There was yet another, completely different, absolutely stunning woman. And she was drunk and partially dressed, driving the commander's car. Marseille wasn't even driving. This beautiful woman with half her clothes on was driving the commander's car. Then, yet another model in the back seat could be seen rapidly getting her bra back on. And of course, buttoning up his uniform, out of the back seat, hopped Marseille. To call the commanding officer livid would be an understatement equivalent to calling Hurricane Katrina a cool breeze. First, Marseille was ordered to call a cab for the two girls, which he would have to pay for, and that would suck because he would be docked a month's pay as well, and just to finish off, he would be confined to his room. Forget the base, forget the barracks, he was not to leave his room unless he was on operations. He would be so well confined, he'd be like a prisoner. He would have his meals brought directly to his room, and he had an armed guard on the door. But, to quote Mackey directly once again, these measures were extreme. Far more extreme than I've ever had to put under any officer. But I had made yet another error. I had forgotten to nail the back window of his quarters shut. Fast forward a few days, Mackey woke up early, ready for the morning reconnaissance flight, and he decided to have a shave. So, his bathroom was one that overlooked the courtyard. While he was shaving, he looked out his window and noticed something. His car had been moved. After he finished his shave, he went outside and spoke to the sentry on guard at the headquarters. "Has anyone driven my car?" The response he got was unbelievable. "Yes, sir. Flying Officer Marseille drove it last night. He got back maybe an hour ago." Enraged, Mackie stormed over to the guard on duty at Joachim's door. "Has he left this room?" "No, sir. No, sir. I've been here all night and he hasn't even left to piss." Mackie opened the door and went inside. He then immediately slipped on an empty liquor bottle and fell on his behind. Getting back on his feet, he noticed that the room was trashed, and in the corner was Marseille, passed out drunk, snoring away. In a fury, Steinhoff kicked the bed frame, sending Joachim tumbling out of bed. He awoke with a start. Holy shit! He then stumbled to his feet. "Pack your bags. When I get done with this morning's reconnaissance flight, I'll decide what to do with you." With that, Steinhoff left the room and went to fly his mission. Marseille was left to sober up and realize that the hour of reckoning was upon him. But again, there was a problem. He was a decorated ace, he had the best flight evaluations of anyone in the Luftwaffe, and his dad was a general. It was obvious he was going through bad mental issues due to his parents' divorce and the pressure to perform with all this great accolades that he'd received. And beneath all of that bad behavior, there was a nugget of pure gold potential. If he sent him back in total disgrace on the court-martial back to Germany, he would ruin Marseille's career. He might even get arrested. So it was definitely going to have to be a transfer. But there's another problem. He was so desperate for pilots. He was begging to get pilots. He was kicking up a storm, and now he's trying to transfer one of his pilots out? How is he going to justify the transfer to command? How is he going to explain why he needed to transfer Marseille without throwing him under the bus? It was then that the gods, or the demons, depending on your perspective, came to Steinhoff's rescue. For as he was sitting in his office, he got a phone call. The head of the Gestapo in northern France wished to speak with him on an urgent matter in person, and was calling ahead to notify him. Steinhoff acknowledged and set up the meeting. Great. The Gestapo want to talk to me. Well, you can't say no to the Gestapo, and sure enough, the afternoon rolled around, and the Gestapo chief entered his office. Steinhoff got him a drink, and one for himself, and asked, quite naturally, what was going on. Why all the secrecy? I mean, I know you're the secret police, but why are you coming to talk to me? What do you have to do with the Luftwaffe, specifically my base? Turns out, it was a private investigation regarding a personal matter. This wasn't official Gestapo business, this was something he was following on his own time. A young Luftwaffe officer based nearby had taken his daughter's honor while she was on holiday from university in Stuttgart. He didn't have a name, but he was very good looking, slightly built, sharp eyes. You know, a bit lighter on the side that you would expect for a military man. A bit shorter. I mean, he looked a bit like fair hair, like, I don't know. The man kept giving the description, and Steinhoff realized that this man that I'm talking to, this Gestapo officer, his features looked a bit familiar. He kind of looked, where have I seen this guy before? He was obviously describing Marseille, there was no question. This is definitely Marseille he's looking for. But why is it... Oh no. It clicked. The reason this man looked familiar is because his daughter must have been one of the girls he had seen getting out of his car and had sent home in a taxi last week. Bingo. That's it. I have my way to get rid of Marseille. Mackie feigned ignorance and advised him to check one of the units down the coast. Maybe Lehrgeschwader 2, for instance. I'm pretty sure he has some information. I mean, Illefeld's a resourceful guy. He'll be happy to help. Payback's a bitch for sending me this trouble. With that, the Gestapo officer left. The moment he was out of sight, Mackie summoned Marseille, who reported, for once, correctly and on time. Steinhoff eyed the young pilot and told him straight away, "Your antics and lack of discipline are a nuisance, but I also understand that you've got a lot going on at home. You have incredible potential, young man. And you need to get yourself back on the horse. You need to get out of this hole you're in. You need to pull yourself together and make something. I'm going to send you to Giga-Chad. They are in Berlin. There you can work stuff out and you can work on yourself and improve and get back to where you need to be. There's also another big reason why I'm getting rid of you. One of the girls that you had with you the other day just so happens to be the daughter of the Gestapo section chief for this part of France. And for your safety, I need to get you the hell out of here. At this news, Joachim stiffened straight up. And apparently, he was packed and ready to go within hours. Later, after the war, after all time would pass, Steinhoff would admit that even though he was furious at him most of the time, the moment he had finished chewing him out and had been dismissed, he would often break out laughing to himself. He really couldn't hate Marseille. He actually loved him to bits. And he really wished that he had lived. In less than a month, Marseille had been kicked out of what would become the most prestigious unit in the Luftwaffe and sent back to Berlin in disgrace. But Giga-Chad was soon to be bound for North Africa, and despite his cavalier attitude, it seems that Steinhoff's guidance had rubbed off on him somewhat. Like his old schoolmaster before, he had told Joachim to get his shit together. And while it would take some time, he decided to do just that. What he needed was a guide, and in a small little squadron yet to make its name, he would find the perfect candidate. And even more vital, he would make what he really needed. Some truly close-knit friends. Hans Joachim Marseille was soon to be sent to where the rains are blessed. And it was here he would be known as the Star of Africa.